It was the smirk that Richard Sterling would regret for the rest of his life. Sitting at the plaintiff's table in Cook County Circuit Court, wearing a custom Tom Ford suit and an arrogant grin, he looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife as if she were a piece of discarded luggage. 2 rows behind him sat his mistress, a 26-year-old PR executive, dripping in diamonds paid for by his company credit card. Richard thought he had it all figured out. He thought he had bulletproofed his assets, hidden his cash, and left his wife with nothing but a worthless prenup. He was wrong. Dead wrong. For 15 years, Claire Sterling played the role of the perfect, unassuming wife. When she married Richard in the fall of 2011, he was a hungry, aggressive commercial real estate developer clawing his way up the Chicago property ladder. Claire, by contrast, was a quiet woman who spent her days restoring antique books and volunteering at the Art Institute. She drove a 6-year-old Volvo, bought her clothes off the rack at Nordstrom, and never once asked about the intricate, chaotic webs of Richard's business dealings. Richard loved this dynamic. It fed his ego. He needed to be the provider, the kingmaker, the man who walked into a room and sucked all the oxygen out of it. And to ensure his empire remained entirely his, he had his lawyers draft an ironclad prenuptial agreement 3 weeks before their wedding. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. What is held in individual names remains individual property in the event of a dissolution of marriage. No alimony, no spousal support. Claire had read the 30-page document sitting in the cold, glass-walled conference room of Richard's law firm, Hastings and Associates. She hadn't cried. She hadn't argued. She merely picked up the Mont Blanc pen, signed her maiden name, Claire Montgomery, and handed it back. "It's just a precaution, sweetheart," Richard had said that day, patting her hand patronizingly. "The real estate market is volatile. I have to protect my investors." 15 years later, that precaution was the weapon he planned to use to execute her financially. The end of their marriage didn't come with a dramatic explosion, but with a series of careless, insulting choices. Her name was Chloe Vanderpump. She was a luxury brand ambassador for a high-end vodka company, a woman whose entire existence seemed filtered through an Instagram lens. Richard hadn't even tried to hide the affair. He flaunted it. There were weekend trips to St. Cast, Bart's charge to an offshore corporate account, late-night dinners at Alinea, and a sudden desperate attempt by Richard to reclaim his youth through hair plugs and leased Ferraris. When Claire finally confronted him in the foyer of their Gold Coast brownstone on a rainy Tuesday evening, Richard didn't apologize. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 18, leaned against the marble island and sighed. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be, Claire," he had said, his voice dripping with tired condescension. "You've known about Chloe for months. I'm moving out. My lawyer, Gregory Hastings, will send over the papers by Friday. We have the prenup. It's clean. It's simple. I'll give you a courtesy buyout on the house, $500,000, tax-free. You can take your books and move somewhere quieter. Maybe Vermont." Claire had stood there, her face a mask of utter calm. She didn't scream. She didn't throw his crystal tumbler against the wall. She just looked at him, a long, piercing gaze that made a brief flicker of unease cross his face. "A courtesy buyout," Claire repeated softly. "It's more than generous considering the prenup," Richard snapped, suddenly defensive. "I built the Sterling Group. Me. You watered the plants and went to book clubs. I'm giving you a soft landing. Take it." He packed 2 heavy leather duffels and walked out the door, straight into an Uber Black that took him to the penthouse he had already rented for Chloe at the Waldorf Astoria. As the door clicked shut, Claire didn't collapse in tears. Instead, she walked into Richard's home office, locked the door, opened her laptop, and initiated a secure encrypted call to a number in Zurich, Switzerland. "It's time," she said to the voice on the other end. "He's filed. Begin the unmasking." Cook County Courtroom, 1904, smelled of lemon pledge, old wood, and the bitter scent of high-stakes animosity. Judge Marilyn Rossi, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for detesting men who hid assets, peered over her reading glasses at the two legal teams. At the plaintiff's table sat Richard Sterling. He looked like a man who had already won. He was whispering jokes to his lead counsel, Gregory Hastings, a shark of a lawyer known for bullying opposing counsel into submission. Directly behind Richard, sitting in the second row of the public gallery, was Chloe. She was completely out of place in a courtroom, wearing a tailored optic white Alexander McQueen suit and oversized Chanel sunglasses pushed up into her bleached blonde hair. But the most offensive detail wasn't her attire. It was the jewelry. On her left hand rested a vintage Cartier Panther ring sapphires and diamonds that had disappeared from Claire's jewelry box 3 months prior. Richard had claimed it must have been misplaced by the housekeeper. At the defense table sat Claire. She wore a simple, unbranded navy shift dress and carried a scuffed leather tote bag. Beside her sat her attorney, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was 68 years old, wore a tweed suit that looked vaguely smelled of mothballs, and had a persistent, slight tremor in his left hand. Richard had laughed out loud when he saw who Claire had hired. He had expected a ferocious Chicago divorce pit bull. Instead, she had brought a relic who looked like he belonged in a probate office dealing with contested wills. "Are we ready to proceed with the preliminary asset declarations?" Judge Rossi asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I have read the briefs regarding the prenuptial agreement. Both parties acknowledge its validity?" "We do, Your Honor," Hastings boomed, standing up and smoothing his silk tie. "The agreement is straightforward. What's his is his, what's hers is hers. My client, Mr. Sterling, has filed a comprehensive and transparent affidavit of his current financial standing." Hastings signaled to his paralegal, who hauled a thick stack of bound documents to the judge's clerk. "Your Honor," Hastings continued, adopting a tone of faux sympathy, "the commercial real estate market has been devastatingly cruel over the last 3 years. The Sterling Group took massive hits during the post-pandemic commercial crash. My client's flagship project, the Ascension Tower on Wacker Drive, is currently hemorrhaging capital. Furthermore, his liquid assets have been drastically reduced due to necessary business restructuring." Hastings paused for dramatic effect. "According to the audits performed by KPMG, my client's current personal net worth, independent of highly leveraged corporate debt, sits at a modest $4.2 million. However, recognizing that his wife has not been employed in a traditional sense for 15 years, Mr. Sterling is prepared to honor a one-time, non-modifiable severance gift of $600,000, provided she vacates the marital home within 30 days. A soft, smug giggle erupted from the gallery. Chloe covered her mouth, leaning back in the wooden pew. Richard didn't even look back. He just smiled at his legal pad. Judge Rossi frowned, flipping through the executive summary of the financials. $4.2 million, Mr. Hastings. Your client was profiled in Crane's Chicago business 18 months ago with an estimated net worth of over $60 million. You are telling this court he lost $55 million in 18 months? "Paper wealth, Your Honor," Hastings replied smoothly. "Valuations are speculative. The reality of commercial debt is unforgiving. The documents, certified by independent forensic accountants, speak for themselves. The money simply isn't there. It was a classic divorce shell game. Richard had spent the last 2 years siphoning capital into offshore shell companies, specifically a Cayman Islands LLC called Blue Horizon Ventures. He had funneled cash out of his domestic accounts under the guise of consulting fees and bad debt write-offs, essentially making himself look poor on paper to ensure Claire got absolutely nothing. He had meticulously planned his own artificial bankruptcy. "Very well," Judge Rossi sighed, clearly suspicious but bound by the documents in front of her for the moment. She turned her gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Pendleton, your client is willing to accept this declaration?" Arthur Pendleton stood up. He didn't boom. He didn't swagger. He slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up a single slender manila folder. Your Honor, Arthur began, his voice raspy but surprisingly steady. We do not contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement. In fact, we rely upon it entirely. As Mr. Hastings so eloquently stated, what is his, and what is hers. Is hers. Richard snorted quietly. He leaned over to Hastings. She's got a checking account with $3,000 in it. Let the old man talk. Furthermore, Arthur continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room, we are not here to dispute Mr. Sterling's creative accounting regarding his net worth. If he claims he only has $4 million, we will accept that figure as gospel for the purposes of this proceeding. Hastings frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his aggressive features. This was too easy. Why wasn't Pendleton demanding a forensic audit? Why wasn't he screaming about hidden offshore accounts? Mr. Pendleton, Judge Rossi asked, raising an eyebrow, are you stating on the record that your client accepts the $600,000 settlement offer? Oh, absolutely not, Your Honor. Arthur smiled pleasantly. My client declines the settlement offer. She doesn't need Mr. Sterling's money. We are simply here to fulfill the court's requirement of filing her financial disclosures as mandated by the state of Illinois. Arthur handed the thin manila folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. You see, Your Honor, Arthur said, turning to look directly at Richard for the first time. When my client signed that prenuptial agreement 15 years ago, Mr. Sterling was so eager to protect his own future assets that he failed to conduct a basic inquiry into my client's existing assets. He assumed that because she drove a modest car and lived a quiet life, she had nothing. Judge Rossi opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first page. Then she stopped. She blinked, took off her reading glasses, cleaned them with a microfiber cloth, put them back on, and read the page again. The silence in the courtroom stretched. It became heavy, palpable. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Chloe stopped playing with the Cartier ring. Mr. Pendleton, Judge Rossi said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous judicial boredom. Are these verified? By whom? Not, by Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management, Your Honor, as well as audited by Deloitte. Arthur replied crisply. Can someone tell me what the hell is going on? Richard whispered harshly to Hastings, his face flushing. Hastings waved him off, staring intensely at the judge. Counselors, approach the bench, Judge Rossi commanded. Hastings strutted to the bench, projecting a confidence he suddenly didn't feel. Arthur ambled up beside him. Judge Rossi turned the document so Hastings could see it. Mr. Hastings, have you reviewed opposing counsel's financial disclosures prior to today? No, Your Honor. They were legally obligated to provide them today, which they are doing at the 11th hour. Not that it matters. Mrs. Sterling's assets are irrelevant to the core dissolution, as she has not generated income during the marriage. She didn't need to generate income, Mr. Hastings, Judge Rossi said coldly. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the top line of the document. Read the summary. Hastings leaned in. His eyes scanned the pristine white paper, reading the bolded black text. Deceleration of assets / Montgomery Sterling, beneficiary and sole controlling trustee of the Montgomery Vanguard Trust. Current valuated trust assets, liquid and non-liquid, $412,500,000 and $1,000 USD. Hastings physically recoiled as if the paper had electrocuted him. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his spray tartan looking sickly and yellow. This is a fabrication. A typo. This is a deliberate attempt to defraud the court. He hissed, his voice trembling. It is fully authenticated, Counselor, Arthur said softly. The Montgomery family built one of the largest private maritime shipping conglomerates on the eastern seaboard in the 1920s. Claire's grandfather sold the fleet in 1988, and placed the entirety of the capital into a blind, irrevocable generation-skipping trust. Claire became the sole controlling trustee on her 25th birthday. That was 2 years before she married my client. Hastings, Whisper shouted, panic bleeding into his tone. Correct, Arthur nodded. And per the prenuptial agreement your firm drafted, Mr. Hastings, any assets held in an individual's name prior to the marriage remain entirely separate and untouchable. Mr. Montague Sterling waived all rights to her wealth. Hastings stared at Arthur, his mind short-circuiting. $412 million. His client's wife, the woman who clipped coupons for laundry detergent and knitted her own winter scarves, was worth nearly $500 million. Is there a problem, Greg? Richard called out from the defense table, unable to handle the suspense anymore. His arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. Step back, Judge Rossi ordered the lawyers. She looked at Richard. Mr. Sterling, your counsel is reviewing your wife's financial disclosure. It appears you were profoundly misinformed about the financial dynamics of your own household. Hastings walked back to the table like a man marching to the gallows. He slumped into his leather chair, shoved the summary page in front of Richard, and pointed a shaking finger at the net worth line. Richard stared at the number. The zeros seemed to multiply before his eyes. $425,000. He let out a strange, breathless wheeze. He looked up at Claire, who was sitting perfectly still, hands folded neatly in her lap, looking back at him with the serene, unbothered expression of a stone statue. You lied to me, Richard choked out, the acoustics of the courtroom carrying his voice to the gallery. Claire didn't react, but Arthur stood up. Objection, Your Honor. My client never lied. Mr. Sterling never asked. In 15 years of marriage, he never once inquired about her family's background. Assuming her quiet demeanor equated to poverty, he was entirely consumed with his own perceived brilliance. Sustained, Judge Rossi said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Sterling, you drafted the prenup. You are bound by it. Wait, Your Honor. Richard panicked, standing up, ignoring Hastings, who was desperately pulling on his suit jacket to sit him down. If she has this much money, if she's been sitting on a dragon's hoard this whole time while I stressed about the business. Richard's mind was spinning, trying to find an angle, a way to claw back control. Then I should be entitled to spousal support. I maintained her lifestyle. You just testified under oath that your net worth is $4 million, Mr. Sterling. Judge Rossi reminded him sharply. Are you now claiming you need alimony from your wife to maintain a lifestyle you yourself provided? No, I'm saying the prenup is unconscionable. Richard stammered, contradicting everything his lawyer had said 10 minutes prior. She withheld material facts before the marriage. Actually, Your Honor, Arthur interrupted, pulling a second document from his folder. We have the original signed prenuptial agreement. Clause 4, Section B, drafted by Mr. B. Hastings himself explicitly waives the requirement for a full financial disclosure from either party prior to signing. Mr. Sterling was in such a rush to protect his first $1 million, he legally barred himself from discovering her wealth. He hoisted himself by his own petard. A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He looked back at Chloe. She was no longer giggling. She was staring at Richard with wide, alarmed eyes, having heard the number 400 million echo through the chamber and realizing none of it belonged to the man paying her rent. Well, Judge Rossi said, folding her hands, it seems the issue of the wife's financial dependence is settled. Mrs. Sterling will not be needing the $600,000 buyout. Now, let us return to the matter of Mr. Sterling's assets. Mr. Montague. Pendleton, do you have any motions regarding his business holdings? We do, Your Honor, Arthur said. The gentle grandfatherly facade completely vanished. His voice turned hard, sharp, and precise. Mr. Michaud, Mr. Michaud Brabonnet, Hastings presented to this court that the Sterling Group is currently struggling, specifically noting the debt on the Ascension Tower project. He claimed his client is practically insolvent due to commercial loans. That is correct, Hastings said defensively, trying to regain his footing. My client owes over $40 million in mezzanine debt on that property alone. The lender is calling the notes due next month. He is facing foreclosure. He has nothing. We are well aware of the debt on the Ascension Tower, Your Honor, Arthur said, pulling a massive, thick binder from his scuffed leather tote bag and slamming it down onto the defense table. The thud echoed like a gunshot. And how are you aware of the intimate details of my client's corporate debt? Hastings demanded. Arthur looked at Richard, a cold, predatory smile finally breaking across his aged face. Because, Mr. Hastings, Arthur said softly, 6 months ago, when my client discovered her husband was spending marital funds to lease a penthouse at the Waldorf for his mistress, she made a minor investment. The $40 million mezzanine debt on the Ascension Tower is held by a private equity firm called Vanguard Real Estate Capital. Richard's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew that name. Vanguard was the ruthless, faceless corporate entity that had bought out his original loan and had been squeezing him for exorbitant interest rates for the last half year, pushing him to the brink of bankruptcy. Your Honor, Arthur continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality, Claire Sterling is the sole owner of Vanguard Real Estate Capital. She owns the debt. She owns the building. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, she has initiated foreclosure proceedings against her husband's company. Richard Sterling didn't say a word. He simply collapsed back into his chair, the arrogant smirk dead and buried forever. The silence that followed Arthur Pendleton's declaration was so profound that the hum of the courtroom's HVAC system sounded like a jet engine. Richard Sterling, the man who had spent his entire adult life controlling every room he walked into, was suddenly struggling to draw breath. His chest heaved beneath his custom Tom Ford suit, the tailored fabric suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Foreclosure, Judge Rossi repeated, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the heavy oak at the bench. Mr. Pendleton, are you stating for the record that your client's trust purchased the mezzanine debt on the plaintiff's commercial property for the express purpose of calling the note, while stating that Vanguard Real Estate Capital, a subsidiary of the Montgomery Vanguard Trust, purchased a non-performing loan portfolio from Chase Commercial Banking 8 months ago? Arthur replied smoothly, not missing a beat. The Ascension Tower debt was bundled into that portfolio. It was a standard bulk institutional acquisition. The fact that the debt belonged to my client's husband was a serendipitous coincidence. Bullshit, Richard roared, slamming his hands down on the plaintiff's table so hard the water pitchers rattled. She knew exactly what she was doing. She bought my debt to ruin me. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, or I will have the bailiff seat you. Judge Rossi barred, her gavel cracking sharply against the sounding block. Richard froze, his face a mottled apoplectic red, before slowly sinking back into his chair. Your Honor, this is an outrageous conflict of interest. Gregory Hastings sputtered, frantically shuffling through his legal pads, as if the right objection was hiding somewhere in the margins. A wife cannot weaponize corporate entities to attack her husband's business during a dissolution of marriage. It's retaliatory. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and offered Hastings a look of profound grandfatherly pity. Mr. Hastings, I refer you back to the prenuptial agreement you yourself authored. Specifically, Section 8, Clause C. Neither party shall have any claim, jurisdiction, or right of interference in the independent business dealings of the other, regardless of any adversarial financial impact. You drafted that clause to ensure my client could never stop Mr. Sterling from aggressively acquiring properties in her residential neighborhoods. You built the wall, Mr. Hastings. We are merely operating on our side of it. Hastings opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The legal trap was flawless. He had spent hours crafting that exact clause to make Richard invincible. Instead, he had handed Claire a loaded gun with no safety. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Arthur continued, handing a stapled packet of documents to the bailiff to pass to the bench, "the foreclosure is not retaliatory, it is simply good business practice. Mr. Sterling defaulted on the loan terms." Richard's head snapped up. "I never missed a payment. The interest was paid on the 1st of every month." "You paid the interest, yes," Arthur nodded. "But commercial mezzanine debt comes with strict financial covenanters. Specifically, the Ascension Tower loan required the borrower, the Sterling Group, to maintain a minimum liquid cash reserve of $10 million at all times to guarantee operational solvency. If liquidity drops below that threshold, the lender has the right to accelerate the loan and demand payment in full." Judge Rossi scanned the documents, her eyes narrowing. "And Mr. Sterling breached this covenant?" "Spectacularly, Your Honor," Arthur said. "According to the financial affidavit Mr. Hastings proudly submitted to this court just 20 minutes ago, Mr. Sterling's liquid assets have been drastically reduced due to necessary business restructuring. He claims a total net worth of only $4.2 million. Therefore, by his own sworn admission to this court, he is in violation of his loan covenant. Vanguard Capital had a fiduciary duty to call the note to protect its investment." The courtroom spun around Richard. He felt entirely detached from his own body. He had purposely drained his domestic corporate accounts to look poor for the divorce, hiding the cash offshore so Claire couldn't touch it. He had manufactured his own insolvency to cheat his wife, and by doing so, he had handed her the legal right to seize his $60 million skyscraper. A sudden sharp sound broke the tension. Click, clack, clack, click. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the gallery. Chloe Vanderpump had stood up. She had grabbed her quilted Chanel handbag and was hastily shoving her phone and sunglasses inside. Her face, previously a mask of smug entitlement, was pale and rigid with panic. She had understood enough of the legalese to grasp the bottom line. The man she was sleeping with was not a high-flying real estate tycoon anymore. He was a man drowning in a $40 million debt to a wife who had the power to crush him like an insect. The penthouses, the St. Bart's trips, the Cartier rings, they were over. "Chloe," Richard whispered, his voice cracking, turning around in his chair. "Chloe, wait. Where are you going?" "I can fix this." Chloe didn't look at him. She didn't even pause. She simply turned on her heel and practically jogged down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden double doors swung open and shut with a muted thud. She was gone. Richard stared at the closed doors, his mouth hanging slightly open. He had thrown away a 15-year marriage, his reputation, and his dignity for a woman who abandoned him the exact second his checkbook ran dry. From the defense table, Claire watched him. For the first time all morning she spoke. Her voice was quiet, cultured, and devoid of any malice or anger. "She has expensive taste, Richard," Claire said simply. "You can't afford her any more." "Quiet in the court," Judge Rossi said, though she didn't seem particularly angry at the interruption. She looked down at Richard, her expression hardening into one of absolute judicial disgust. "Mr. Sterling, you are currently facing the loss of your primary commercial asset due to a default you engineered. I strongly suggest you and your counsel use the lunch recess to figure out exactly how you want to proceed. Because right now, you are standing on the edge of a cliff, and you are holding a shovel instead of a parachute. We are in recess until 1 o'clock. Not the ma. The 2-hour recess was a nightmare for Richard Sterling. Hastings had dragged him into a small, windowless attorney-client consultation room down the hall from courtroom 1904. The air in the room was stale, smelling of nervous sweat and cheap floor wax. "How could you not know?" Hastings had screamed, his face inches from Richard's, completely abandoning his usual deference to the wealthy developer. 15 years, Richard. You lived with her for 15 years and you didn't know she was sitting on $400 million? She drove a Volvo, Richard yelled back, pacing the cramped room like a caged animal. She bought her shoes on sale. She spent her weekends dusting old books at the library. People with that kind of money don't act like that. Not so. Old money does, you absolute moron, Hastings hissed, rubbing his temples. They don't flash it. They don't lease Ferraris. They quietly own the buildings you begged to borrow money for. And now she owns you. We can fight the foreclosure, Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. We can file an injunction. We can claim predatory lending practices. Something. With what money? Debaz. Hastings shot back. You declared $4 million in assets tied from the divorce. Vanguard Capital has the financial backing of half the Atlantic seaboard. They will bury us in litigation until your legal fees eclipse the value of the building itself. We have to settle. You have to give her whatever she wants. No, Richard slammed his fist against the wall. I built the Sterling Group. I'm not letting her take my flagship property just because she played me. I have the cash to cover the covenant. I just have to move it back. Hastings froze. He slowly lowered his hands from his face and stared at his client. The color, which had just started to return to his cheeks, vanished again. Move what back? Hastings asked, his voice a dangerous, quiet whisper. Richard swallowed hard, suddenly realizing what he had just admitted. The liquidity. I have the capital to cure the default on the Ascension Tower. Richard, Hastings said, his tone turning remarkably cold. 10 minutes ago I handed Judge Rossi a sworn financial affidavit signed by you under penalty of perjury, stating your total global assets were $4.2 million. Are you telling me that affidavit is false? It's compartmentalized, Richard deflected, sweating profusely now. I moved $45 million into a holding company in the Caymans. Blue Horizon Ventures. It was just to keep it off the books during the divorce so she couldn't get her hands on it. I can wire $10 million back to the corporate accounts by tomorrow to satisfy the Vanguard covenant and stop the foreclosure. Hastings stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then very slowly, the high-powered lawyer began packing his briefcase. What are you doing? Richard panicked. I am withdrawing as your counsel, Hastings said, snapping the locks on his leather briefcase shut. You can't do that. We're in the middle of a hearing. Watch me, Hastings growled. You just admitted to hiding $45 million in offshore accounts to defraud your wife, and you used me to submit a perjured document to a sitting judge. Marilyn Rossi is a former federal prosecutor. If she finds out you lied on a financial disclosure, she won't just sanction you, Richard. She will refer you to the state's attorney for criminal prosecution. You are looking at wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and perjury. I am not losing my law license because you couldn't keep your pants zipped and your books clean. Greg, please, you can't leave me out there alone with that monster. Richard begged, grabbing Hastings' arm. Hastings yanked his arm away. You created the monster, Richard. Now you get to be eaten by it. At exactly 1 p.m., the court was back in session. Hastings stood before the bench looking physically ill. Your Honor, Hastings said, his voice stripped of all its previous bravado. Due to an irreconcilable breakdown in the attorney-client relationship, I must formally request to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Sterling, effective immediately. Judge Rossi raised a single sharp eyebrow. She looked at Richard, who was sitting at the plaintiff's table looking utterly destroyed, and then back to Hastings. Withdrawing in the middle of a preliminary hearing is highly unusual, Mr. Hastings, Judge Rossi said slowly. Unless, of course, counsel has discovered that their client has provided them with materially false information that the court is currently relying upon. Hastings swallowed hard. I am bound by attorney-client privilege, Your Honor. I can only state that I can no longer effectively or ethically represent Mr. Sterling. I see, Judge Rossi said. She turned her steely gaze to the defense table. Mr. Pendleton, do you have any objection to Mr. Hastings' withdrawal? None at all, Your Honor. Arthur said pleasantly, standing up. "In fact, we anticipated it, and it saves me the trouble of cross-examining him regarding the fraudulent nature of the plaintiff's financial disclosures." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with renewed terror. "Fraudulent?" Judge Rossi prompted, leaning forward. "Indeed, Your Honor," Arthur said, reaching into his battered tote bag and pulling out a final, pristine white folder. "During the recess, my client's forensic accounting team, formerly of the FBI's white-collar crime division, completed their trace of Mr. Sterling's recent corporate wire transfers. While Mr. Sterling claimed he was taking losses on his real estate ventures, he was actually systematically liquidating his domestic holdings and funneling the proceeds into an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands known as Blue Horizon Ventures." Arthur handed the folder to the bailiff. "Inside, Your Honor, you will find the wire transfer receipts, the Cayman LLC registration documents bearing Mr. Bering Sterling's signature as the sole beneficiary, and a current account statement showing a balance of $46.8 million worth. Money he deliberately hid from this court." Judge Rossi didn't even look at the documents right away. She just stared at Richard Sterling. The silence in the courtroom wasn't heavy this time, it was lethal. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Rossi said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "did you sign a sworn affidavit submitted to my court this morning stating your total net worth was $4.2 million? Richard opened his mouth, but his throat was so dry he couldn't make a sound. He looked at Hastings, who was staring fixedly at the ceiling, completely disassociating from the man sitting next to him. I, Richard stammered. "Because if you did," Judge Rossi continued, her voice rising in volume and power, "and if these documents prove you are hiding $46 million in offshore accounts to defraud your wife in a dissolution proceeding, you have not only committed perjury in my courtroom, but you have committed a felony offense under Illinois state law." Richard buried his face in his hands. The arrogant real estate king of Chicago, the man who thought he could discard his wife with a $600,000 payoff and a worthless prenup, was sobbing into his palms. Arthur Pendleton looked at Claire. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't gloated. She sat exactly as she had at the beginning of the day, calm, composed, and utterly unbothered. She simply nodded once at Arthur. It was the nod of an executioner signaling the drop. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, "given the plaintiff's blatant perjury and attempt to defraud the court, we formally request that the prenuptial agreement be set aside and that all of Mr. Sterling's assets, both domestic and hidden offshore, be frozen immediately pending a full criminal investigation." The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 1904 remained shut, trapping Richard Sterling inside a nightmare of his own meticulous design. Judge Marlene Rossi did not bang her gavel. She didn't need to. The sheer radiating fury coming from the bench was enough to paralyze everyone in the room. Richard looked wildly around the space, his eyes darting from the empty chair where his bulldog lawyer, Gregory Hastings, had sat just moments before, to the serene, unreadable face of his wife. Claire was watching him the way a scientist observes a particularly frantic insect in a glass jar. There was no pity, there was no gloating, there was only absolute glacial finality. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Rossi's voice cut through the stagnant air like a whip, "you are currently without legal representation. However, you are still under oath. I am going to ask you one time, and I strongly advise you to consider the Fifth Amendment before you open your mouth. Are the documents provided by Mr. Pendleton regarding Blue Horizon Ventures authentic?" Art Sappat. Richard's custom Tom Ford suit, which had felt like armor that morning, now felt like a shroud. His mind raced desperately, cycling through lies, half-truths, and deflections. He was a master negotiator, a man who had talked his way out of multi-million-dollar zoning disputes and hostile takeovers. He just needed an angle. "Your Honor," Richard rasped, standing up. His legs trembled so violently he had to grit the edge of the plaintiff's table. This is a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding. The funds in the Cayman accounts are not personal assets. They are operational reserves for the Sterling Group. It's a standard tax deferment strategy used by every major developer in Chicago. Hastings told me to move it. He advised it. Arthur Pendleton let out a soft, dry chuckle that echoed painfully in the silent room. A fascinating defense, Mr. Sterling. Throwing your recently departed counsel under the bus. Unfortunately, it lacks a certain factual basis. Arthur didn't even bother to stand up this time. He simply slid a single piece of paper across his table toward the center aisle. Your Honor, Arthur said mildly, if Mr. Sterling is claiming those are corporate funds, he is confessing to corporate embezzlement. The $46 million sitting in Blue Horizon Ventures did not come from corporate revenue. According to our forensic trace, the money was systematically siphoned from the couple's joint investment accounts, home equity lines of credit, and the liquidation of marital stock portfolios over a period of 18 months. He stole from his own marriage. That's a lie, Richard shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The veneer of the polished tycoon was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate panic of a street-level con artist. She never cared about the money. She didn't even know what accounts we had. I earned every dime of that wealth. She sat in a library while I built an empire. You built a house of cards, Richard, Claire spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a commanding resonance that instantly silenced him. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the heavy wooden table. You spent 15 years assuming my silence was stupidity. You assumed my thrift was poverty. You thought because I didn't demand to see the ledger, I couldn't read the numbers. She tilted her head, her gaze piercing right through him. I knew about the offshore transfers 3 days after you made the first one. I let you keep doing it. I let you drain the domestic accounts. I let you build your little Cayman Island lifeboat, because I wanted to see exactly how far you were willing to go to leave me with nothing. Richard stared at her, the breath hitching in his throat. You set me up. I gave you enough rope, Claire corrected him coldly, and you enthusiastically tied your own noose. Oh. Judge Rossi pressed a button on her bench, summoning her clerk. She leaned over, whispering furiously into the clerk's ear, who nodded with wide eyes and practically sprinted out a side door. Mr. Pendleton, Judge Rossi said, returning her attention to the floor, you requested that the prenuptial agreement be set aside on the grounds of fraud. Given the irrefutable evidence of gross financial misrepresentation and perjury, I am highly inclined to grant that motion. However, regarding the offshore accounts, the jurisdiction of an Illinois family court has practical limits when it comes to the Cayman Islands. Mr. Sterling could walk out of this courtroom, board a plane, and access those funds. A sudden, fleeting spark of hope ignited in Richard's chest. She was right. The judge couldn't seize international money today. If he could just get out of the building, get to O'Hare Airport, he could fly to a non-extradition country. He had $46 million. He could start over. He just needed to survive the next 10 minutes. I will surrender my passport, Your Honor. Richard blurted out, a pathetic eagerness bleeding into his voice. I will cooperate fully with the domestic audit. Just please don't invalidate the prenup. We can negotiate a fair settlement right now. I'll give Claire the house. I'll give her the $4 million domestic cash. She can have it all. Arthur Pendleton actually sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked up at the judge. Your Honor, there is no need to worry about Mr. Sterling fleeing to access his offshore funds, Arthur said, his voice returning to its grandfatherly cadence. As for the jurisdictional limits of this court, we anticipated that hurdle. While my client's family wealth is deeply rooted in shipping, Her trust employs a highly specialized legal team in international banking. Arthur opened his battered leather tote bag one last time. He pulled out a thick document bound in heavy blue paper, bearing the raised gold seal of the British Overseas Territories. At 8 a.m. this morning, local time in Georgetown, Grand Cayman, Arthur announced. Our international counsel, Jonathan Pierce of Maples Group, appeared before the Grand Court of the Cayman Islands. Armed with the forensic evidence of Mr. Sterling's wire fraud and embezzlement, we filed for an emergency Mireva injunction. Richard felt the blood drain completely from his face. His knees buckled and he collapsed heavily into his chair. For the record, Arthur continued, turning slightly so Richard could hear every agonizing word, a Mireva injunction is an international freezing order. It is an equitable remedy designed specifically to prevent a defendant from dissipating assets worldwide. The Grand Court granted the injunction at 9:15 a.m. The accounts of Blue Horizon Ventures are completely frozen. Mr. Sterling cannot access a single penny. The bank will not even let him check the balance. You took everything, Richard whispered, his voice cracking, staring at the polished wood of the table. He was a hollowed-out shell, a man who had gambled his entire existence on his own superiority and lost in devastating fashion. No, Richard, Claire said softly, rising from her chair. She smoothed the skirt of her unassuming navy dress. You gave it away. You gave away your marriage for a PR girl who ran at the first sign of a bounced check. You gave away your business because you couldn't stand the thought of me having a fair share. You engineered your own total destruction. The side door of the courtroom clicked open. The clerk returned, followed closely by two men in dark conservative suits. They didn't look like bailiffs or local police. They possessed the distinct, rigid posture of federal agents. One of them, a tall man with a severe crew cut, flashed a gold badge to the armed court deputy standing by the door. Richard didn't even notice them. He was staring blankly ahead, trapped in a catatonic state of shock. Let the record reflect, Judge Rossi began, her voice echoing with absolute authority, that this court finds the plaintiff, Richard Sterling, has committed egregious intentional fraud upon this court. By submitting a sworn financial affidavit that deliberately concealed nearly $47 million in offshore assets, the plaintiff has engaged in perjury and a bad faith attempt to manipulate the judicial process of the state of Illinois. She picked up her gavel, weighing it in her hand. Therefore, the motion by the defense is granted. The prenuptial agreement signed by Claire Montgomery and Richard Sterling is hereby declared null and void under the doctrine of fraudulent inducement and unclean hands. It is completely set aside. Richard didn't flinch. The words were just white noise now. Furthermore, Judge Rossi continued, even the plaintiff's documented dissipation of marital assets, his attempt to artificially engineer the insolvency of his commercial businesses, and his malicious intent to impoverish his spouse, this court is exercising its right to disproportionate, equitable distribution. Judge Rossi looked directly at Claire. Mrs. Sterling, the $4.2 million in domestic liquid assets currently held by your husband are awarded to you in their entirety, effective immediately, to offset the emotional and financial distress caused by his fraudulent actions. Thank you, Your Honor, Claire said, her tone polite and even. As for the $46.8 million frozen in the Cayman Islands, the judge turned her furious gaze back to Richard. Those funds were determined to be marital property stolen by the plaintiff. A constructive trust is hereby imposed on those assets in favor of Mrs. Sterling. Mr. Pendleton, you are authorized to work with the Cayman courts to repatriate those funds directly into your client's accounts. We shall begin the transfer protocols this afternoon, Your Honor. Arthur nodded, a ghost of a smile on his face. Richard Sterling was officially bankrupt. He had lost his $60 million skyscraper. He had lost his $4 million in domestic cash. He had lost his $46 million in offshore hidden funds. He had lost the Gold Coast brownstone. He had nothing but the Tom Ford suit on his back and a leased Ferrari he could no longer afford to put gas in. However, Judge Rossi said, leaning forward, steepling her fingers, the division of assets is merely the civil conclusion to this disaster. Mr. Sterling, you sat in my courtroom and attempted to use the law as a weapon of theft. You committed perjury. You committed wire fraud by moving stolen funds across international borders. Judge Rossi gestured toward the two men standing quietly by the side door. During the recess, I took the liberty of contacting the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. Special Agent Miller of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division has been reviewing the forensic accounting file your wife so graciously provided to the court. Richard finally looked up. He saw the agents. The reality of the situation crashed into him with the force of a freight train. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was federal prison. You can't, Richard gasped, hyperventilating. He looked at Claire, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any shred of dignity. Claire, please, I'll do anything. Please call them off. I'm your husband. We loved each other. Claire looked at him, her expression hardening just a fraction. You didn't love me, Richard, she said quietly. You loved the fact that I was convenient. You loved that I was quiet. And when I was no longer convenient, you tried to throw me away. The people you are looking at right now, they are the consequences of your own actions. I'm not calling them off. I'm going home. Judge Rossi brought the gavel down with a deafening crack. Court is adjourned. Special Agent Miller, the plaintiff, is yours. The two federal agents moved swiftly across the courtroom. Before Richard could even stand, they had flanked him. Agent Miller grabbed Richard's arm, hauling him to his feet. Richard Sterling, Agent Miller said, his voice flat and robotic, you are under arrest for perjury, wire fraud, and the evasion of federal banking regulations. Turn round and place your hands behind your back. No, 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 Richard sobbed, trying to pull away. But the agent's grip was like iron. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, locking his hands together. The sound echoed in the massive room, the final punctuation mark on a 15-year lie. Arthur Pendleton neatly packed his files back into his scuffed leather tote bag. He offered his arm to Claire. She took it gracefully. Without a backward glance at the man she had been married to for a decade and a half, Claire Sterling walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors opened for her. Outside the Daily Center, the crisp Chicago afternoon air smelled like rain and exhaust. Pulled up to the curb, idling quietly, was a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. An older gentleman in a sharp suit stood by the rear passenger door. "Good afternoon, Miss Montgomery," the driver said, holding the door open, using her maiden name. "Good afternoon, Thomas." Claire smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Take us to the Art Institute, please. I have some rare books to restore." She slid into the plush leather seat. As the car pulled smoothly into the downtown traffic, back inside the courthouse, Richard Sterling was being led into a holding cell, a man who had tried to bury his wife, only to realize he'd been digging his own grave all along. What a spectacular downfall. Richard thought he was the smartest guy in the room, playing a high-stakes game of chess, completely unaware that his unassuming wife owned the entire board. His sheer arrogance blinded him to the fact that you never underestimate a quiet woman, especially one with a $500 million trust fund and a brilliant forensic accounting team. Let this story be a massive warning. Greed and hubris will always write their own tragic ending, and attempting to hide assets in a divorce is a guaranteed ticket to federal lockup. If you love this story of ultimate courtroom karma and absolute justice, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a brilliant revenge story, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping real-life drama and insane legal twists. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Claire's shoes? See you in the next one.